good.
Welcome to the Contrarian Capitalist podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by returning guest John Carter from the very popular Postcards from Barsoom Substack channel. John, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Good to be back on.
Always like having a chat with you. And first of all, many congratulations on uh, going over 20,000 subscribers. I know that's I think a milestone for anyone uh, on Substack or in any writing industry. So congratulations on that. And last time we spoke, you were in the depths of Eastern Europe, and you have changed continent as well. So have I. Plenty to talk about, but probably as you are Canadian and you have just written a fantastic piece on the Canadian election, that's probably the best place to start. What what's going on? Why has it happened? There's a lot of argy-bargy on the ground, a lot of people unhappy. The floor is yours, my friend. Go into whatever tangent you want. What's going on in Canada?
Yeah, so we had a snap election called by the new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who is still the Prime Minister, because the result of the election was that we went from a minority Liberal government propped up by the new Democratic Party to a minority Liberal government propped up by the new Democratic Party, which instead of having for the next year, we will have for the next 4 years. So lucky us. I was initially a little bit surprised that Mark Carney called the election so, like, basically immediately after he won the Liberal leadership race that began when Justin Trudeau resigned in early January. I figured, he would want to play out the clock until he had to have an election, use that time to try to burnish his
Hmm.
image or what have you. In retrospect, it was a brilliant political move because he basically was able to take advantage of 2 months of campaigning instead of one, throughout the entirety of which the media was shining his balls. Um, so, like, and if you look at the poll numbers, it's sort of interesting. It's like, Mark Carney enters the leadership race, conservative poll numbers start dropping, they cross over. Uh, when Carney wins the leadership race, and then the conservative poll numbers just kept on steadily dropping as the campaign went on, and he was able to slightly increase the number of seats the liberals had by cannibalizing the New Democratic Party and to a certain degree the Bloc Québécois, Quebec. Um, so yeah, people are. I mean, some people are very unhappy about this. Some people are very happy. It depends on which people you're talking about, right? So the immigrant vote, they're very happy about this. They tend to break liberal. The baby boomer vote, they came out in droves to support Mark Carney because their top priority was sticking it to Donald Trump, and they thought that
Hmm.
Carney would be um, the strong man who could do this. Out west, they are furious that they've been locked into power once again. Another 4 years of getting royally screwed by Ottawa. Back in 2021, after the Conservatives lost the election, Wexit started like Western Exit started um, trending on Twitter. This time around, literally the day after the election, the Premier of Alberta changed the referendum rules to
Hmm.
dramatically reduce the number of signatures that are required to trigger a referendum on separation, and to extend the time frame available. But like the time frame thing seems like that won't even be necessary because the referendum petition got to half the number of required signatures in a day. I
Wow.
haven't checked since yesterday, but like, yeah, no, right. So things are moving fast now. They're furious. So it'll really interesting to see what happens because the Albertans, a lot of them want out, either as their own country or to take up Donald Trump's offer of joining the United States. Um, so that could potentially happen very rapidly, uh, which I don't think Ottawa would take well at all because Alberta is basically the only thing propping up the Canadian economy right now. That and the real estate bubble. Um, so I would expect they would dispute that rather vigorously, and that could lead to, I think, great ugliness. And I've written about this. I had an article titled "Ukrainada" about a month ago, um, sort of looking at ways in which things could fall apart in Canada in a very destructive fashion.
Mhm.
And sort of wondering if that might even be like the plan, like the same way that the U.S. Sort of cleaved off Ukraine from the Russian sphere of influence and then turned it into this like massive nuisance and security threat for Russia, and then ultimately was able to draw Russia into a very destructive war. Um, now that now that Washington has kind of slipped the leash of left wing globalism, um, the the Blue Empire is kind of retrenching the provinces in the European Union, United Kingdom, and of course in Canada. And it would make a lot of sense to sort of try to use Canada in the same way that Ukraine was used against the United States as a sort of forward operating base, as a neighboring pain in the ass security threat. Um, and then, of course, the parallel of Alberta and the Ukraine would be with the Donbass,
Mhm.
where those regions broke off right after the Maidan, which then led to a civil war and then ultimately became the pretext for the actual. So whether it would come to shooting or not, I don't know. But I mean, Canada doesn't have much of a military, so there is. Uh, but then again, you don't need much of one to start because Alberta also doesn't have anyone under arms yet. They've got a lot of armed cowboys, though.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll make reference in the Substack post that comes with this. I will make reference to the article Ukrainada and also the one that you've just written recently. I would urge people to go and definitely read them. They're very informative. For for those that might not be overly familiar with Canadian geography, because a lot of listeners
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Yeah, fair.
from different parts of the world, can you just give as best as you can on a podcast, just describe a bit more about the Canadian geography so people can try and visualize what's happening. Again, I'll send people to the post because you've put a couple of maps in there, but just for podcast format, yeah, just explain the best you can so
Yeah,
we
so Canadian political geography and physical geography are actually very closely correlated. It's a very relevant question. So you essentially have three primary power blocks in Canada. These correspond to the French Canadians in Quebec. That's way out in the east of the country, sort of along the St. Lawrence River. Um, the next one would be sort of like the Anglo Canadians in Ontario, which is that's just above the Great Lake region, right next to Quebec. That's where Ottawa is, where Toronto is. It's where the United Empire Loyalists settled in the early 19th century. Um, it's sort of traditionally the most British part of Canada. Uh, and it's sort of the imperial center of the country. So the Canadian politics, like the federal state is sort of set up almost as this kind of continental resource extraction system that inhibits political power at the periphery while drawing resources from the periphery to be sort of collected and distributed from the center. Um, and then west of Ontario, so west of the Great Lakes, you have the prairies, which stretch on for a few provinces: Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. Uh, Alberta is where Canada's tar sands are, most of the hydrocarbon deposits. That's why Alberta is so wealthy. Um, the culture in Alberta is sort of Texas North, you might call it. They're more conservative, fiscally as well as socially. They're a bit more Christian. And not really. Canada's not really a religious country, but they are a bit more Christian than Ontario or Quebec. Um, and that's basically your third power center, the Western elites out in Alberta, whose, of course, their economic base is hydrocarbon industry. Um, and then you have the Rocky Mountains in British Columbia, which go, right at the Pacific Ocean. Most of British Columbia is it's largely uninhabited. It's all mountains. But that's where you have down in the southwest corner where you have Vancouver, which is sort of the third largest city in Canada. And that, of course, is like all the big cities are all sort of like your deep red territory. Red in Canada, as in the UK, corresponding to the dominant left Liberal Party.
Mhm. So there's one chart that I did see over the last couple of days I thought was very interesting. I think it was the election results from British Columbia, so what you're talking about there. And I think it was pretty much all
Mm-hmm.
blue apart from the center of, or pretty
Yes.
much what I would look at as the center of Vancouver. And I thought that is absolutely phenomenal how that can occur. So no wonder so many people are having are feeling ruffled and a bit, pissed off at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that in itself, I think, is not so uncommon, right? I mean, you look at the Americans have, pretty much the same thing where the urban centers are invariably Democrats, the rural areas and ex-urban areas are invariably Republican. If you look in a blue state at a county by county level, like New York State or California, you'll see that like the Democrat votes are heavily concentrated in the cities, but you get outside the cities, it's all Republican territory. So the distinction between blue and red state is largely like sort of a matter of the balance of urban versus rural populations.
Mhm.
Now, it's very similar in Canada. Uh, so, if you just look at the color coding of the provinces, you're like, okay, Alberta is conservative, Saskatchewan's conservative, British Columbia, think, I can't remember if they went conservative or liberal overall. Um, Ontario is liberal, but then if you look on a riding by riding basis, you see that even in Alberta, if you zoom in on Calgary and Edmonton, they went liberal. Like maybe only one or two ridings right in the heart of the cities, but they went liberal. Similarly in Saskatchewan, I think similarly in Manitoba, Manitoba went largely conservative. Zoom in on Winnipeg, liberal. You look at
Mhm.
Ontario. I mean, Ontario has all of like most of the largest cities, which are very notably red. But if you look at the rural areas, with a couple of exceptions, again, they tended to go conservative. The exceptions to that in Canada, because you do see a few rural ridings that go liberal or more rarely the Democratic Party. You'll usually notice that those are way out in the hinterland,
Mhm.
like way up north. Um, and that's because they had large Native American, like Indigenous First Nations contingents who are a liberal client group for the most part. So they sort of swing the vote towards the liberals because they'll get bought off essentially. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, I mean,
Okay.
if you're a rural voter in like British Columbia, then yeah, you're definitely not happy about all of that. They had a similar issue actually in the provincial election that they just had recently. New Democratic Party was able to grab control of the province. Um, I believe it was actually a pretty tight election, so my guess is it was very similar. The provincial Conservative Party very likely was winning all of the rural areas, and then just the demographic weight of Vancouver just dominates everything. And this happens in Ontario as well all the time. It's it's very frustrating, and I thought for a long time actually that uh, we could probably stabilize a lot of the political um, discord in our countries if we just like made the urban areas kind of independent polities, like unlinked from rural hinterlands.
Hmm.
To say, like, instead of having, for example, in the Canadian case, instead of having like, Toronto and Ottawa being included in the province of Ontario, just be like, no, 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 the city of Toronto is also the province of Ontario, and the city of Ottawa is also the province of Ottawa, and they have no input over the politics of the rest of the sort of rural parts of the province, which could allow, two very different groups to sort of, go their own ways, um, run their own territories according to their own rules with sort of, minimal interference from the other. Um, but I don't think the cities would ever go for that because, like, you know, they need those tax dollars.
No, of course, there's a lot of I think as always with politics, there's a lot of moving parts, and I put a note on Substack the other day, and it's not I'm not Canadian citizen. It's not my job to poke my nose in, but I did point out I'm British, so my job is to poke my nose in because that's what we do. It's what we
Mm.
like to do, and it
You guys have
seems
been interfering in Canadian politics since the beginning of Canadian politics. Canadian politics was British politics until very recent. So,
Yeah, well, that's actually the point I was going to come to the intertwining there between the UK and Canada in terms of politics. But I think
mhm,
the point I made that, and I can't speak for everyone that's not Canadian, is that I look at X amount of years under Trudeau and so forth, and it seems like Canadians have just gone out and voted for more of the same, but with a different person in charge. Doesn't make any sense to me
mhm.
at all. So I don't know if you've got any number one, if you've got any thoughts on that from an external point of view.
Oh, no, 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 no. This actually makes perfect sense. For the last few years, there were these "fuck Trudeau" flags all over the country, bumper stickers. You walked around even downtown Toronto, you'd find these like kind of like permanent little rallies of people like waving these flags. People during COVID, especially, and kind of like cresting with the trucker convoy, came to despise Justin Trudeau, very specifically that person. Um, uh, just a depth of loathing that has never been seen before in Canadian politics. Um, but I mean, obviously, like a lot of the people who hated him also were sort of like, yeah, and he's the leader of this criminal organization called the Liberal Party. But you know, uh, he was the lightning rod that kind of soaked up all of that anger and resentment. Um, and in in January, he basically offered himself up as a sacrifice chicken. He took the sins of the party upon himself, essentially, and allowed his political neck to be snapped, and took those sins with him in the eyes of many voters. So I was actually not surprised that Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, got trounced so badly. A lot of people were shocked by this, but like, you go back to like, say, like November, anytime really between like August of last year and like early January, and the conservatives were like polling, 20 points above the liberals. They were just, in Poly market, it was like, like 99% chance of like a conservative majority government, right? Everyone thought it was just like, it's a lock in. Um, but the thing was, the conservative policies were not really any different from the liberal policies. Uh, they, they refused to say anything about mass immigration at all for the longest time. Um, when they did talk about immigration, it was stuff like the left would be like, "Oh, we need to have direct flights to Amritsar to, make it easier for them to come over. Essentially, we need to, um, like streamline the immigration process, make it more efficient. Uh, and the only problem is housing. So we're just going to have to build houses within pasture. Meanwhile, Toronto is like, just like nothing but condominiums now, like, because they've been building so fast. Uh, and and as I've pointed out repeatedly, it is with our current technological stack literally impossible to build houses as quickly as you can move people around, which is actually a different situation from say 400 years ago when you were limited to moving people across oceans in big leaky sailing ships that would take several weeks to cross. In that several weeks, it would bring those 50 or 100 or whatever new settlers. Lots of new housing could be built, or those settlers themselves have ample time to build their own houses and available raw materials before the next great wave of settlers arrive. Now jet travel, like you can just pack people into a country at the rate of thousands of them a day, which we have been doing. Like we bring over over 1 million people a year for a few years now, and like 500,000 a year for the years before that. Like so. You've got this, Pierre Palet, he's refusing to say anything related to immigration. He's like not really differing from the liberals much on any of their policies. He disagreed about the carbon tax, but he was using all similar tactics to Justin Trudeau. Like, Trudeau was kind of infamous for playing Mr. Dress Up, like putting on ethnic costumes when he went to, pander to some ethnic minority. And, Palev he was doing the same thing all the time. Um, and if you looked at, like, there was actually a survey of conservative supporters last year, why do you support the conservatives? And yeah, 60% of them were like, oh, because I like Palev and I like the conservatives. But 40% of the people polled were like, I just really hate Justin Trudeau, right? So, like, basically, Palev's only selling point was that he is not Justin Trudeau. And then once Justin Trudeau was out of the picture, then he was no longer running against Justin Trudeau. He was running against someone else. Um, and suddenly he has to run on the strength of his policies and his own personality. His own personality is actually deeply annoying. He's like that like twerpy little kid in the back of the class who makes like annoying little comments to piss off the teacher, but doesn't actually say anything constructive himself. Like that. That's basically Colette. Uh, and he spent his entire life as a politician. Literally straight from university into political life. Never had a real job. He's just like this like wormy little operator. Um, Arnie, well, I mean, the man has this like long career in finance. He worked like Goldman Sachs, and then he was the governor of the Bank of Canada, and then he was the governor of the Bank of England. And he worked in the United Nations on the some climate commission or something. He presents as this kind of calm, competent, masculine technocrat type, which actually locks in perfectly with like what the Canadian median Canadian voter sort of prefers to see in their leadership class, because we are a very sort of paternalistic and authoritarian country at heart. Um, and a lot of that, I think all of that is all just image on his part. I mean, his actual record as a governor, the central bank governor, has been disastrous. Like he presided over the flatlining of England's economy. His economic advice to Canada resulted in the flatlining of our economy. We have no gold reserves, by the way, in our central bank. Like we sold off all of our gold reserves, which happened after he was the governor. But I can't help but wonder if maybe he might have had something to do with that. Um, he's I have read that he had a really bad reputation internally at the Bank of England. Like they just really disliked the guy. But he puts on a good image, right?
Yeah.
He's sort of like that archetype of the somewhat slimy corporate CEO who talks a really good game at the shareholders meeting in front of the board and then just runs the company into the ground, but jumps ship to the next company with his golden parachute, before disaster strikes, and just kind of hops from job to job to job doing that. Um, So yeah, that's sort of how we ended up with this guy. Like it's and he's already he's already talking about doing some fun stuff. So there's talk that the liberals will start taxing home equity. So if you've paid off your mortgage, they're coming for like your unrealized capital gains in the form of the value of your house. Which, if they do that, I will find that very kind of amusing because the baby boomers were the single largest bloc supporting Mark Carney, and that's going to screw them real bad. Uh, so the other thing is that he's a big climate guy,
Mhm.
and he did not say a word about climate during the entire campaign because he knows quite well this is a deeply unpopular position to take in Canada right now. Because we hear that and we're just like, oh, you mean poverty, great. And now that he's locked in for the next 4 years, he in like one of his first things he says like, oh yeah, we're going to center climate. It's like every financial decision the government makes. Like this is going to be such a catastrophe. Um, it'll be interesting to see what happens to Canada. I mean, like, it's entirely possible that before we even have the next federal election, like the West will have split off. The West splits off. There's no more equalization payments, which means you can't bribe Quebec to stay in the country anymore, which means Quebec probably hives off shortly after. Then what happens to Canada after that? Like, if to me, I would, in the long run, I would guess it sort of gets broken down for parts and digested by the American Empire. Um, but yeah,
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I would, for people watching the video, I'm laughing to myself because at some points, given what you were talking about, I didn't know if you were talking about the UK or Canada because it sounds so
yeah,
familiar. It sounds so
yeah,
familiar
yeah.
with
So
everything you just said.
I've written several articles about British politics last year because I mean there was a lot happening in British politics. So and I had a few Brits be like, wow, like you have a lot of insight into British politics. Like, well, it's because there's a lot of it's like
Yeah, it just just what you're
and
talking about there. Amazing.
it is the same transatlantic elite, right? I mean, these
Mm,
people all are sort of part of the same club, and you'll notice, and this is true with the Australians as well, by and large. You'll notice that when talking points shift in one Anglosphere country, they tend to shift to all of them simultaneously. So, like last year, towards the end of the year, you started seeing like Keir Starmer. Maybe not last year, maybe just a couple months ago, actually you start seeing Keir Starmer making sort of these almost like nationalistic, like patriotic kinds of rhetoric.
mhm,
Um, uh, and then right around the same time, like Mark Carney starts talking about Canada's proud British and French heritage, and like really playing up to like these kinds of nationalist sentiments, and kind of trying to like downplay the woke multiculturalism a little
mhm,
bit. Kind of, and Starmer is like, he's making, very displeased noises about the two-tier sentencing guidelines that have come out of the out of that particular, I can't remember the name of the Quango. I'm sure you know the one I'm talking about. It's all very disingenuous, of course, right? But it's like clearly like, in their little club, they're like, ooh, we've really lost the hearts and minds here. Okay, we need to like narrative switch to get them back on board.
mhm. Yep, yep. All sounds part of the same playbook. You're spot on. When one country, it's like it's a Commonwealth thing. When one country does it, the others have
Mm-hmm,
got to follow. The others have got to follow. And yeah, it was
mm-hmm,
just what you were talking about there. Because I know last time we spoke, we looked at, yeah, immigration, migration, remigration. Yeah, we spoke about all of that,
mm-hmm,
and it was interesting. The point that I picked up on there was when you were talking about members of the party, needing to deal with flights to various parts of India or whatever it was. And we had a similar thing a little while ago in I think it was in Birmingham, right in the Midlands in the UK, and they had put,
Mm.
I want to say it was 3 million. It was something stupid like £3 million in order to. There was a project in like Lahore Airport in Pakistan to make transport easier. It's something I'll try and find it and I'll put a link into it. It's thinking that's 3 million quid
Didn't
of just
didn't
nonsense.
Birmingham, wasn't that was isn't that the city that went bankrupt?
Yes, yeah, one of many left-wing
Yeah.
councils
Yeah,
that
but
have gone bankrupt.
yeah,
Yeah.
but because like because they got sued for wage discrimination because they were paying female DEI consultants less than garbage men or something. So they like, okay, we're gonna pay everyone the same. And then the garbage men were like, well, we're not getting paid enough, so we're gonna go on strike. And like the city went bankrupt. So that's hilarious. So on top of all of that, and then the Birmingham City Council was like, oh yeah, also we're gonna put £3 million into helping develop like this airport in Lahore so we can import tax eaters even more efficiently.
Hmm. Uh-huh. Yeah, and again that's why I was laughing because when you were talking about that in Canada, I was thinking of those stories here. What going back to Canada, John, because I don't want to be hogging this conversation because your insights are obviously incredibly important. Two two things on your most recent article. One is a very famous image if I think of this baby boomer putting the old middle fingers up, which I think's
The Bradford boomer,
absolutely
yes.
brilliant. I have to say, I think
Like
that's
I saw that. I saw that when it came out, and I was like, "That is iconic. This is immediately. This is gonna enter the meme lexicon, and we will be
uh-huh.
seeing this image for years to come because it's just so perfect. Like the little smirk on his face, the double middle fingers, just the "I've got mine" kid. Like, and I'm gonna keep getting mine. Fuck you, Like, wow.
It's but
Wow.
absolutely brilliant. Yeah, that's meme worthy. And
It
then
just it encapsulates an entire generation with such perfection. Like,
and the second point, which again I don't know. Obviously, I'm not boots on the ground, so it'd be good to get your insight on this. Is I know you touched upon, most important factors when deciding to vote, and for a lot of people, baby boomer generation, it was sticking
oh,
things up to
that,
Donald
yeah,
Trump. But
right, right.
more interestingly, is most people concerned about reducing the cost of living, yet with the policies that we've touched upon, that I can tell you now that's going to end up not very good. So what's going to happen moving forward? What can Canadians do, or what do you think is going to
Oh
happen?
man, what can Canadians do? Get the fuck out. Would be my first piece of advice, to be perfectly honest.
Fair
Um,
enough.
uh, like if it's not possible to leave Canada, like try moving to Alberta because that might be leaving Canada. That might be another way to leave Canada actually. In the near term. Um, uh, and yeah, I don't think there's much good news for Canadians in Canada in the near future. The currency certainly isn't going to improve. The fundamentals of the economy are not going to improve. The public debt is like some of the highest in the world. Like Ontario has more public debt than the state of California, not per capita. I mean, like the absolute number.
Wow.
That the absolute monetary amount. Yeah, that is insane. Um, and there's been zero per capita economic growth in like 10 years, while the public sector has, this is in Article 2, the public sector is, ballooned by 25% over like a similar time frame. 20, like 1 in 4 people are working for the public sector in one capacity or another. The government is like spending 2/3 of every dollar in the economy, just keep wasting most of it. Um, it's 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 uh it's a grim situation. There's no indication that the housing bubble is going to come down. But if the housing bubble does come down, okay, houses will be affordable, great, but like that'll probably take the banking system with it,
Yeah.
quite honestly, because of the currency crisis or something like that. So like under current management, I just don't see uh how Canada rights the ship. I think the mismanagement at this point, like it's not a matter of steering the ship away from the rocks, right? Like it's gonna hit rocks. Like and there's basically nothing I think that can be really be done. Like, um, which is one of the reasons I'm just increasingly like, yeah, it's probably the best case scenario is probably Canada getting absorbed into the US. The worst case scenario is that the country fragments into a bunch of little statelets that then are just kind of, you know, pushed around by the US as like de facto territories.
Mm.
Um, and they just become like economic backwaters. Maybe Ontario turns into some kind of woke North Korea, like the United Kingdom is turning into. Uh, like, um, yeah,
Yeah, I didn't want
it's
to. Yeah, it's. Yeah, I know we've both had a little chuckle. I appreciate that. Yeah, sometimes when you have such adverse circumstances, reaction might be just to laugh and joke about it. I mean, certainly, I look at it from the outside, and whether it's tax policies or trying to tax unrealized income and things like that. And I could tell you from
mhm,
experience just in the UK, or when I was in the UK, you look at it and you just wonder, why on earth do you think that's even a good idea? It should be
right.
you have a lot
Yeah.
of fantastic things in Canada, a lot of wonderful people, a lot of natural resources, and to me, it's seemingly Canada is a very proud country, but it also seems to me that it can be a lot better internally than it already is. And again, that just comes
So,
down
so,
to
so
attitude.
Canada, in a sense, Canada's sort of crumbling into what it already was, which is a third
Okay.
world country. So,
Mhm.
the Canadian economy has largely been based around resource extraction and just like selling raw resources on the market, which is a very third world business model, actually.
Mhm.
There hasn't been a whole lot of manufacturing in Canada, and what manufacturing was down in the Great Lakes region got nuked by NAFTA when that got pushed through, which is all just a rust belt, right? So, and then the other thing is that, as I mentioned before, the sort of political structure in Canada, which is just designed to centralize power as much as possible in sort of the, the center, not the geographical center, so the political center of the country, sort of around like the Laurentian area, hence the Laurentian elites, sort of like the Ottawa, Montreal sort of area. Um, and this is like an Anglo-Franco elite, sort of about 500 old families, and um, they play prominent roles in the government, but they only infrequently in a public-facing role. Like they usually kind of like they're in the background. They own the large corporations, which have a very cozy relationship with the governments. They all have these kind of like cozy like monopolies and duopolies and such, oligarchy. Um, which the regulatory environment favors their companies, and they're able to like keep competition down. And of course, they're very prominent in like senior roles in the bureaucracy, and they just kind of like, they're the people who own and run Canada, and they own it and run it for their own benefits. And this is actually very similar to Latin America, where most Latin American countries, you've got like this handful of old money families who have been running it since the Spanish conquered it back in the day, and everyone else is just immiserated. The only real difference being that in Latin America, the wealth contrast is historically always been very extreme. Um, Whereas in Canada, it's been less extreme for I mean, you have a much higher ratio of resources to people in Canada. So you've been able to maintain a first world standard of living even without like advanced manufacturing economy. Um, but that's changing. That's changing very quickly. And the Laurentian elite, they don't care. They're taken care of. Like, it's no deal to them. They just build the walls higher, and the little gated communities, whatever. As long as they're getting theirs, they're not overly concerned with whether
Mm.
Canada develops, you know. And you'll note that like, Canada's got this vast potential actually, um, which is almost entirely unrealized, because they're not motivated to do it. They don't really build things. They own them, they extract resources from them, and they're good with that. And
Mm.
as long as those people um, remain in charge, I don't really see that changing. Like no matter how bad it gets for the rest of the country, I don't think they care.
I would ask, I would ask what happens next, but I asked that earlier on. So I think the best place to almost wrap up is to ask you if there is, obviously we've explored a lot of different things today with regards to, Canada itself, politics, people, etc. Is there anything else that you haven't discussed, or is there anything else on your mind that you would like to discuss before we wrap up?
Open-ended question like that on the subject of Canadian politics, and I guess like one thing that I wonder about is if there could be some kind of dark horse effect. Um, we've had a populist party in the form of the People's Party of Canada, this kind of libertarian guy, Maxime Bernier, for 10 years. He formed the party. He used to be like a conservative member of parliament, and he was the front runner to become the leader of the party like 10 years ago. Uh, and then there were like sort of backroom shenanigans. And he was considered too much of a radical, so they sort of basically they rigged the vote at a party convention and put this total non-entity Andrew Scheer into the position. And Bernier said, nuts to this. I'm going to start my own political party with blackjack and hookers. That's only a slight exaggeration. But they're the only party that really has any that has like a hard anti-immigration platform that has any intention of sort of reducing the scope and size of the Canadian government and sort of all of these things. But they have made absolutely no dent on the political scene in Canada. I don't think they've once cracked 1% of the vote uh, in like the popular vote in a federal election. They've never managed to get anyone in a seat in parliament, including Maxime Bernier himself. Um, and you compare that to the performance of populist parties in Europe or even the United Kingdom, where the Reform Party comes out of nowhere and grabs 12% of the vote, 4 seats, but they got 4 seats in the parliament, their very first election. Uh, Look at the AFD, they're basically the largest party by vote count now in Germany, Rassemblement National in France, the Sverige Demokraterna in Sweden. I mean, like, sort of uh, the European populists all seem to do really well for themselves. And like, in Canada, this hasn't happened. And I sort of suspect that might be because the People's Party, in addition to having all of the usual hurdles of being called fascist, racist Nazis by the media, getting locked into debates, and all the things that the European media and the British media do as well to their populist insurgencies. They also just don't quite click with the Canadian people. I think because of the libertarianism. Like I said before, Canadians are very paternalistic, very authoritarian, reactionary people at heart. Um, so, something that I've been wondering about, I haven't really written about this in any detail, because I'm not sure exactly what to do with it yet. But like, uh, if if you if either a new party or like a sort of insurgent takeover of the Conservative Party
Mm.
that presented Canadians with a genuine alternative to the sort of left globalism, multicultural model liberals have been foisting on us for the last 50 years. Uh, and sort of like, rather than being like, let's be market libertarians or whatever, which, Canadians are like, why? Like, that's Americans. We don't want to be Americans. But like, um, you know, like went in a much more hardcore Canadian direction. uh, of like not saying not getting rid of the government, but like transforming the government into an actual tool for nation building, which is what it was
Hmm. Hmm.
historically. Um, uh, like a strong pro-military, sort of an almost an ethno-nationalist kind of thing, but in a very Canadian sort of context. And just but also doing the calm, competent technocrat vibe, but for real, rather than Mark Carney's kind of simulacrum. And whether something like that might be able to resonate with enough Canadians that it could actually sort of like grab control. Right? It's sort of like a reminding Canadians of who they actually are. Um, like maybe something like that could actually, pull Canada's ass into the fire. But like, I mean, the hour's late, man. Like it's, I don't, like this, I don't have a lot of hope at this point because, as at the actual fact and the facts on the ground are, you got like a third of the population basically are foreigners now. Because and like that's just going to increase rapidly because liberals are just going to keep packing it in. You've got the baby boomers who are just going to be completely deaf and dumb to anything like anything along those lines. You've got all the public sector workers who, like they're not going to vote for a smaller rice bowl, and like these coalitions, like that's hard to overcome. Like the liberals have built in for themselves sort of like, you know, a pretty high floor of electoral support just with all of the patronage that they hand out.
Well, it's a somber note to end on, but a realistic note to end on, I think. And we spoke about this last
I
time.
know.
Being
I
realistic is
usually like try to end my articles on something of an up note because I like to try to remain optimistic. But that last one with the Canadian election, I had a hard time finding, like
yeah. No, I appreciate that. I respect that because it's yeah. With again with your writings as well, it's always about providing trying to look for the optimist side, also providing a realist side, and sometimes it's just very, very
mhm,
difficult
mhm,
to do that. All I can do, John, is to say, echo what you said, and if people are, young Canadians or Canadians in general, there's always going to be a plan B, and if you haven't got a plan B, get one very quickly because. Yeah,
mhm.
from the outside looking in, it does not look like that's going to end very well, and I don't say that
No, and and
lightly.
and
It's not good.
and young Canadians, like almost anyone with any talent, and they've been leaving the country in droves anyhow for years. I've seen a lot of people suggesting that Trump could basically economically nuke Canada just
Mhm.
by offering any Canadian who wanted it American citizenship and conversion of their assets into American dollars on a one-for-one basis, and like basically like all the all the smart Canadians, all the talented Canadians, all the Canadians with any resources would just be like, bye. And like, and then like, the country's economy would just fall apart. Like it's, there's very little organic support left inside Canada amongst the younger generations now because they've just been kicked around so badly.
Yeah, it's yeah, as we said, it's a somber note to end on, but a realistic one nonetheless. That's almost an ingenious idea if you're Donald Trump to maybe do that.
Mm-hmm.
But again, we'll leave
This
that
is
for
one of the
another
reasons
time.
I increasingly lean towards the North American integration because there would at least be a certain glory in continental fortress empire. Uh, being part of that, I think, something like that actually could reawaken those loyalist impulses in Anglo Canadians that have been dormant for so long. It's like, oh, okay, we have an empire to belong to again, which is actually worthy of the name, like badass when we sign up for the military.
Let's see what happens. I think it's pretty much all we can do is to sit back and see what happens. John, appreciate
Mm-hmm.
your time as always. It's always very thought-provoking conversations. Always like to give people the opportunity to let let the audience know how you can be found. I appreciate it's going to be Substack and X, but I'll leave the floor with you. How can people find you, get in touch with you, and follow your work?
Postcards from Barsoom on Substack, barsoom.substack.com. That's the main page. And Martian Weird Lords, WYRD on X.
Fantastic. And as always, I will put all of those links and so forth into the notes that come with this podcast. John, great to catch up again. Maybe next time we catch up, maybe we're both in different continents again. Who knows? But I say between now and then, let's see what happens in the world, and we'll catch up hopefully towards the end of the year.
Cool, man. Thanks a lot for having me on. It's been fun as always.